everybody, welcome. I'd like to say good evening to all of you. My name is Deandra Rose. I'm the Director of Research for POLIS, Sanford's Politics Center. And on behalf of our Faculty Director, Matt McCorkle, and the entire POLIS team, we're excited to welcome you for tonight's discussion. We are especially lucky to have with us Professor Lisa Griffin, Professor Bruce Jentleson, and Professor Asher Hildebrand to talk with us about the political, legal, and national security issues that surround the House inquiry into President Trump. And to moderate tonight's discussion, we have our very own B.J. Rudell, who is the Associate Director of POLIS. B.J.'s career has included stints on Capitol Hill, on a presidential campaign, in a newsroom, in classrooms, and for a consulting firm. He's authored 3 books and numerous political op-eds, including those written for the Dallas Morning News and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He's also shared political insights on CNN, Fox News, and dozens of additional radio and television stations across the country. So please join me in welcoming B.J. and our panel.
All right, thank you all for being here tonight, and I'd like to introduce now formally our 3 panelists following up on Deandra's introduction. Lisa Griffin, far to my left, is the Candace M. Carroll and Leonard B. Simon Professor of Law at Duke Law School. Her scholarship focuses on evidence theory, constitutional criminal procedure, and federal criminal justice policy. Her most recent work concerns the status and significance of silence in criminal investigations, the relationship between constructing narratives and achieving factual accuracy in the courtroom, the criminalization of dishonesty in legal institutions, and the political process and the impact of popular culture about the criminal justice system. Thank you very much for being here. And Professor Bruce Jentleson is the William Preston Few Professor of Public Policy and a professor of political science here at Duke. He previously served as director of the Terry Sanford Institute of Public Policy, now known as this Sanford School. He has served in a number of policy positions, most recently from 2009 to 2011 in the Obama administration as senior advisor to the State Department Policy Planning Director. He's the former Henry A. Kissinger Chair in Foreign Policy and International Relations at the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. And last year he received the American Political Science Association International Security Section Joseph J. Krusel Award for Distinguished Public Service. And directly to my left, Asher Hildebrand is Associate Professor of the Practice in the Sanford School. And prior to joining the Sanford faculty this fall, he served for nearly 15 years in Congress and on political campaigns, holding senior leadership roles as Chief of Staff to U.S. Representative David Price, and as Director of Policy and Research for President Barack Obama's 2012 campaign in North Carolina. He has also worked for the International Foundation for Electoral Systems in Beirut, Lebanon, and for 2 foreign policy think tanks in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Asher Hildebrand. So to start things off, Professor Griffin, if you could illuminate a little bit the high crimes and misdemeanors standard for impeachment. What is that, and how does that fit in today?
So the short answer about what it is it's whatever Congress says it is. And the longer answer is that it's a phrase, a term of art that comes to us from the common law and made its way into the Constitution. The drafters of the Constitution gave us 2 examples, bribery and treason. But then they just framed a very large category that they called high crimes and misdemeanors. The one thing we do know is that it does not mean a statutory crime or an actual violation of the criminal law. It means something like an abuse of power. The use of the phrase high crimes is a reference to someone in a position of power, hence the high, and the crime is an infraction rather than, again, some kind of statutory violation, and it's usually taken to mean some sort of abuse of that position of trust or position of power. The addition of misdemeanors is a little bit mysterious, but intended, obviously, to broaden the category to which this might apply and to reach some unanticipated factual problems that might arise in the future. That said, if you look at what the framers said about impeachment and how they thought that it would go were it ever to happen, they were spot on. They were exactly right about the polarization that it would cause. They were exactly right about the nature of the debates that would ensue. And they were also right about the kind of infractions that might give rise to such a drastic procedure, which is what we're seeing now.
Thank you. Professor Jentleson, given everything that's happened the first nearly 3 years of the president's term, why did this Ukraine issue give the impetus to an impeachment that didn't happen with Russian meetings and election hacking and other issues?
Yeah, that's a good question, because we had so many other issues along the way, and then suddenly the Ukraine issue, and we saw this huge political movement. And I think the two biggest signs of that movement were the shift in Speaker Nancy Pelosi's position, in which she had been arguing no, particularly it wasn't good politics for Democrats for a number of reasons, and she switched. And the other, I think, that was really interesting was a group of 7 first-term members of Congress, 5 of whom were women, all of whom came from swing districts that Democrats hadn't typically won, and most of them had careers in national security. Lisa Slotkin from Michigan had worked for the Defense Department, another had worked in the Navy, in the intelligence community. And because they were from Trump swing districts, they were a little reluctant to go in that direction. But with people from national security backgrounds, this really struck a chord. And I think it struck a chord for a number of reasons. You know, here was Ukraine, which had been, first of all, territory had been annexed by Russia in 2014 and had been invaded by Russia. And the international community, you know, has lots of issues that it goes back and forth on. But one of the issues since World War II that it's tried to really make firm is interstate aggression, right? The notion of seizing another state. And this was done by Russia. And so the support for Ukraine had really been bipartisan. During the Obama years, the amount of money that Congress, there's few debates about what kind of aid should be given. And so here was an issue that, you know, was central to people's conceptions. There were already concerns about, you know, just cozying up to Russia and Putin and the like. And then the blatancy of the phone call, even the initial partial transcript that the White House itself released, had that phrase, "Do me a favor." You know, now you could probably go back and look at all the old Sopranos, and I don't think Tony may have ever said quid pro quo, but this can be implied. And that was the version that the White House released. And so, and then you had, I think the other point, 2 other points I'll make. One was that people saw this as a pattern. There had been some sense that the president had been putting, not just politics enters into foreign policy, but not so much personal political interests. Going back to his first trip to Saudi Arabia in May 2017 and the hands on the golden orb when the Saudis supposedly said they were going to buy $110 billion worth of American arms, and as of about a year ago, they'd only purchased about 14.5. There was a sense this wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a pattern. And then you had all the validators, decorated military officials, career ambassadors who really didn't have any axe to grind. You couldn't really say they were never Trumpers. William Taylor, who's somebody that I know and a couple of my colleagues at Duke have worked with, is about as straight as they come to say that these were radicals. So you put it all together, and it made this qualitatively different, and then it's kind of cascaded since then to keep its momentum going.
Thank you. Professor Hildebrand, last Thursday, pretty momentous occasion after many weeks and weeks of holding off, and even months if you go back to the Mueller report. The House of Representatives approved rules that would govern a formal impeachment probe. And 2 Democrats sided with Republicans. No Republicans sided with Democrats. And curious what your reaction was to that kind of very rigid partisan divide.
Well, I was a little surprised that Speaker Pelosi chose to hold the vote in the first place, because in so doing, she kind of conceded the president's argument that a formal vote was required for this to be a real impeachment. And as far as I understand, there's not any constitutional basis for that, although there's some precedential basis. On the other hand, it also kind of called the president's bluff in that they said, okay, we'll formalize the impeachment. You've made this the basis of your argument against it. I'm personally not optimistic that it would lead to much greater collaboration on the part of the administration, but it might make, insofar as there ends up being a separate article based on obstruction of the impeachment inquiry, it might make that article stronger or more clear-cut. In terms of the partisanship of the vote, I would like to say I'm surprised, but unfortunately can't claim that I was. It would have been a more interesting question 2 months ago or even a month ago when the Democratic caucus especially was more divided, and you had Speaker Pelosi kind of holding back the door, trying to respect the interests of her more moderate members in the face of increasing activism among the Democratic base in support of impeachment. But that ship has sailed, and you now saw near unanimity among Democrats in support of this. On the Republican side, in the last couple of weeks, there have been some signs of tentative defection at the very margins of the Republican conference, mostly among members who have decided to retire. But when so much of the argument that Republicans have made against impeachment has been a process-based argument, saying that the process is illegitimate, then it's awfully hard even for those members to cast a vote that would in effect legitimize the process. And so I was not surprised to see it be a party line vote.
Thank you. Professor Griffin, there's a longstanding Justice Department policy ruling that states a sitting president cannot be indicted, goes back to the 70s. And you teach a class called The Presidency and Criminal Investigations, which in part explores the legal boundaries around the criminal justice process's interaction with the White House. So tell us, is it true that a sitting president cannot be indicted? Basically, what can you tell us that you've told your students?
Yeah.
So the history of that memo is really interesting because it was actually drafted. The original research was done when they were trying to figure out what to do about a blatantly corrupt vice president in the 1970s who was Spiro Agnew. And they wrote that memo in response to the question, can we indict the vice president? Because they were trying to pressure him to resign, and he seemed to have some idea that he had some immunity. And they wanted to make it clear that he could be indicted, and the results of their research actually ended up accompanying a detailed explication of his incredible criminality and prompting him to resign. And the process of determining that they could, in fact, indict the vice president, they did extensive research about the president's potential immunity from indictment, which they weren't uninterested in at the time. It was 1973. And that memo became the basis for the 2000 memo on which the Justice Department relied and to which I think Robert Mueller felt himself very tightly tethered, perhaps more so than some people anticipated at the advent of his investigation. In between those two memos, there are 5 other Office of Legal Counsel inquiries into the same question, and they do not all reach the conclusion that the president cannot be indicted. In fact, around the time of the Clinton impeachment, there was an inquiry that came out the other way, and so there has been argument in the background. It's also important to bear in mind this has never gone to the Supreme Court. This is something that was decided internally at the Justice Department, which has historically been somewhat impervious to political forces, and I think today it's fair to say is entirely overtaken by political forces. But that means that we have not seen the judicial branches engage fully with the question of whether or not the president can be indicted. It makes some sense to say that a criminal trial of a president during the time period of the presidency prevents the president from performing constitutionally significant functions. And that is probably a conclusion that most people would sign off on. Where it gets more controversial is whether or not you can have charges against a president and then suspend them and not have a trial during the course of the presidency. Many commentators would say the charges themselves, the indictment hanging over the president, will distract the president from his or her duties, and that in and of itself is getting in the way of the exercise of constitutional authority. The problem with that is that many crimes have statutes of limitations that will run during the pendency of a president's term. So a sort of third-tier argument is that in a situation where it appears that a president may be susceptible to indictment, that there should be an agreement to toll the statute of limitations so that charges aren't entirely prevented by the president winning re-election. So there are a lot of complicated questions there. I think the answer is that it's not clear. It's never been decided by the Supreme Court. The great weight of authority at the Justice Department now says, no, you cannot indict the president. And it was a very heavy influence on the course of the Mueller investigation and the decisions that they made.
And a quick follow-up on that. Do you envision a situation where Chief Justice Roberts decides Trump's fate?
There are a couple of different scenarios that implicate Chief Justice Roberts in the near and far terms. I think this will likely be the most momentous term of the Supreme Court in recent history. I'm not sure that they are going to decide the question whether the president has to turn over his tax returns to state criminal enforcement authorities, because it's a really easy question. If they take that case, then I think we're headed for some very uncharted territory about the Supreme Court protecting the president, because it's such an easy question. The Second Circuit yesterday said that the trial court is right and that the president does have to give, because he is not immune from what the states, right? They have their own criminal enforcement apparatus, and they're in some states going ahead with that. It's not the president himself right now who is in their crosshairs, but the Trump organization, which has tax returns, which they would like to see. And the president repeatedly has lost his claim in court. He's made a very bold claim that no authority, state, federal, or otherwise, can investigate any activity that he engages in while he's president. That is his claim. He's forthrightly had lawyers walk into court and make that claim. This is the shooting someone on Fifth Avenue argument. And it came up in those terms in this litigation, and they shocked the judge by saying, correct, he could murder someone and nobody should be able to do anything about it. No serious legal authorities think that that is the case. So he lost, and he lost again yesterday in the Second Circuit, and people are now saying he wants the Supreme Court to take it. I think it would be interesting if they did. They might. They could also, without taking it, having it fully briefed, and they could just issue some sort of memo. They could grant but immediately remand it with some explanation of why they're doing that. So there are a lot of intermediate types of dispositions that I suspect they'll try to find to navigate their way through these very complicated scenarios. Of course, Chief Justice Roberts will preside at the trial in the Senate that I think we are almost certain to have, at least for one day, unless there's a motion to dismiss on day one. And ultimately, Chief Justice Roberts and not Majority Leader McConnell may be the one who decides whether the trial goes forward and whether there's going to be evidence presented. It's a little unclear who actually is helming that ship. The majority leader's on the jury. It's not clear that he's presiding over the court. And the Constitution does give the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court that authority. So it will be interesting to see. He is a pretty low-key guy. I doubt what Chief Justice Rehnquist did during the Clinton impeachment trial is he kind of wore a costume. He showed up with gold bars on his black robes, which he said was a tribute to Gilbert and Sullivan. He was a big musical fan, and he was playing a part. But he relished the moment. I'm not sure that Chief Justice Roberts similarly looks forward to his role in the proceedings to come.
And to put some perspective on that for those of you who were not alive then, that was the first trial since Andrew Johnson. So it really was this shocking moment for Americans that is no longer maybe as shocking. Yeah. Professor Jentleson, this whole inquiry kicked off with a whistleblower coming forward and a reconstructed transcript of a conversation between Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky. Can you walk us through how this phone call, how Trump's challenges to his own staff, to national security officials, threats against the whistleblower, that's not meant to sound partisan. He has issued strongly worded accusations and threats against this unnamed whistleblower. How does this impact our national security?
So in terms of the chronology, I would say the best, there's a lot of things to read out there. Ambassador Yovanovitch's testimony that was released yesterday was 500 pages. But the best chronology is really Ambassador Bill Taylor's, because he walks you through everything. Everybody else has had snippets. When a president makes a phone call with a foreign leader, there are others on the phone. And notes are taken in one of the secure rooms in the basement of the White House or the old executive office building. and recordings are made. And so there were people, not the whistleblower, but apparently the military officer, Dinderman, who came forward, who, by the way, it's amazing how these things connect. In the Ken Burns series a number of years ago on immigration, he and his twin brother, who's a lawyer at the National Security Council, were in that as 6-year-olds wearing their shorts on a bench in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. So, here he is, amazing things. And he was an immigrant from Ukraine. And so there were a number of pieces of evidence about what happened in the call. All these things. It was put in a particularly secure computer, which you don't usually do these things with. A lot of testimony, but it was preceded by a number of events. And Ambassador Taylor, who had been ambassador to Ukraine before, had finally retired from the Foreign Service, was working as a vice president at the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is actually right next to Sanford, was asked to come back and serve again. But the dynamics and the sequence of events in which the ambassador was recalled were quite scary. In fact, yesterday, adding to everything else, she said she got a call at 1 a.m. in the morning while she was still in Kiev from the head of the Foreign Service saying, you need to get on the first plane out because I'm worried about your security. Now, I don't want to go back to The Sopranos again, but just think about those kind of statements. So what's happening around the world? At the same time, the president makes this very impetuous decision to simply abandon our role with the Kurds in Syria. Now, Syria is not an easy issue. I worked on it in the Obama years. I'm not going to tell you there's been a simple solution to this. But the element of the policy in northern Syria, which was simply 200 American soldiers, special operators, acting largely as a protective buffer and deterrent to protect the Kurds while they were doing other things to keep Turkey out and Bashar Assad from coming out, was actually working pretty well. And the notion that the president made this decision without any process, without any consultation, was so bad that actually Mitch McConnell, who has been, Donald Trump all the way, felt compelled to write an op-ed in the New York Times saying why I don't agree with this. I mean, that was sort of the first time McConnell ever showed any, daylight between him and the president. And so what's happening is allies are, the cover of The Economist last week was Who Can Trust Trump's America? Right? The Economist is not exactly a radical magazine. But you put it all together, what he did to the Kurds for no apparent reason other than whatever he has going with Erdogan, and people can speculate about, business interest or, a hardline leader liking a hardline leader. There have been many other incidents. He went, when Theresa May was still president of Britain, he went to Britain and gave interviews why he preferred Boris Johnson, right, to a sitting prime minister. He's basically snubbed the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. And so many allies were really concerned with this notion of basic trust, not just there are plenty of disagreements on policy. At the same time, adversaries are saying, oh, okay, Trump is basically looking out for his own interests. So people have been saying, so some of the tips that you can take from an espionage point of view is, he conducts a lot of business on personal phones. Well, thank you very much, Or you have these scattered situations where, Rudy Giuliani, as was put in the press, butt-dialed an NBC reporter when he didn't know it. And so if you're looking out there for finding information on Americans, it's like a field day right now, all the things that are being revealed. And other leaders, frankly, also are learning how manipulable the president is. I mean, Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, largely did that. Said, I'll give you the summit that you want for the photo op, and then I'll go back and do what I want to do. And Putin has done it and others. So the international consequences, I mean, I said to a journalist the other day, there have been many presidents I disagreed with, but there's never been one that I truly, truly think has been dangerous to the country and the world in these ways. And so all of this is part of a piece. It wasn't just, oh my God, this happened. It's so different than everything we've seen about Donald Trump. Maybe it's an isolated incident. It'll slide away. It sort of manifested and reinforced and took to another level a whole variety of concerns that people in the international community have.
Quick follow-up. Some would say that other presidents have behaved in realpolitik ways as they see it with foreign leaders, and that we don't always approach things through rose-colored glasses in terms of how we approach others and what we want out of them. We're not entirely virtuous nation, and we at the same time attempt to be a virtuous nation. And I guess my question is one of the challenges with Trump, in light of all the things you pointed out, is one of the challenges that all this is out in the open. And is that part of the challenge for national security?
Well, there's nothing wrong, frankly, with being realpolitik. You have to do that a certain amount of times in foreign policy. And the Kurds have been deserted by the Americans a number of times. In the mid-1970s, Kissinger and Gerald Ford deserted them because they're actually trying to work out some issues with the Shah of Iran. In 1987-88, Saddam Hussein actually gassed them. And you had a bill to cut off, Iraq at that point was the third biggest recipient of American agricultural aid. And a bill passed the Senate, co-sponsored by Ted Kennedy and Jesse Helms. Find that again, right? To cut off our aid, and the Reagan administration didn't want to do it because they're more concerned with Iran. So realpolitik is realpolitik. This was different. There was no realpolitik reason for doing this. This was impetuousness, some narcissism. And again, there's a critique, and maybe we'll get into this in questions, about American foreign policy now. The whole question of, I'm not at all saying that we should continue on with the war in Iraq or Afghanistan, but it's what you do and how you do it that has the implications. And so there wasn't a realpolitik. This was just personal preference in a situation that was counter, really, to American interests.
Thank you. Professor Hildebrand, I was wondering if you could share some kind of role play a little bit. If you were a Republican member of the House or a Democratic member of the House, what as a Republican member of the House would bring you over to the side of what Trump did is wrong and impeachable? And on the Democratic side, what do you think would bring you over to the side that it just doesn't rise to that level?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer, in part because it's partly a matter of the evidence that might come forward yet in a hearing, and so certainly if there's a kind of game-changing revelation beyond what we've already seen, you might see the sort of hard partisan cast that this has taken so far begin to crack a bit. But I think more than anything, what's been responsible for changes in sentiment among the parties has been the way the American people have changed their views on this issue. And just in the last 2 months alone, I think support for roughly corresponding with the time that since the Ukraine revelations broke, I think support for impeachment has risen something like 13 points among Democrats, about 10 points among independents, and even 3 points among Republicans. And of course, there are also all kinds of personal values-based judgments that members are making, such as the national security arguments that Professor Jentleson references. But if public opinion looks like it's leveled out a little bit, right? So right now, hovering around kind of high 40s, maybe very low 50s in support of impeachment. But if that trend continues at all, based on how the public phase of this process unfolds, and especially if you get to a point where a majority of independents support impeachment and Democratic support continues to tick up, it's going to be tougher and tougher for Republicans to maintain a unified front, I think. And maybe this is my own bias, I'll confess this, I have a harder time to see Democrats going back now that they've crossed the Rubicon, those who have now support impeachment, because that decision, so much of the evidence is already on the table, and that evidence is not going away. And a lot of Democrats have made the conclusion that it's sufficient. And so there's no way to sort of undo that decision. To me, the more interesting question is, does this continue to be just a strictly partisan process as it moves through the House and into the Senate? Or are there any sort of defectors on the Republican side?
And to follow up, is public opinion kind of a main driver here? Is it? You worked on the inside for years. If you were there now, and what's the calculus? If you were in a district that was maybe a reddish district working for a Democrat, or a bluish district working for a Republican, how do you read the tea leaves? What's for those who have not worked on the Hill like this guy? What goes into that thinking of damned if you do, damned if you don't?
I guess the first reaction I have is that I don't want to portray that it's purely causal in one direction, right? Because my experience has been that public opinion, that Congress, individual members of Congress, are highly responsive to public opinion, but that the decisions Congress made can also feed back into public opinion and change it. And I think you've seen that in previous impeachments. So I was not alive during the Nixon impeachment. That never was. I'll confess that. But one thing we were discussing a moment ago is that on the day that the Watergate hearings opened, public support for removing Nixon from office was at 19%, right? Fewer than 1 in 5 Americans supported it. By the time that he resigned from office, it was almost 60%, right? And so the actions of Congress in that case, the evidence that came to light, the good reporting that was done had a major impact on public opinion. Now, this is not 1974, right? And the highly polarized environment, there are sort of tighter constraints both at the low end and at the high end of public opinion. But I do think there's already been a pretty dramatic swing in that there's room for additional support, growth in support as this process moves forward. If you're an individual member in that situation, I mean, it's always a combination of sort of being responsive to the public. Sometimes that means looking at broader measures of public opinion. Sometimes that means being responsive to the most vocal members of the public in your home district. But you're always balancing that against your own values, your sense of patriotism or what's right, your ideology, as well as your loyalty to party and to the president. And it's a combination of all of those things. But I do think in the story of the last 2 months, public opinion kind of became a key enabling factor for the speaker to decide to go ahead and move forward with this stage of the process.
Cool. Thank you. So I'm going to go through with one more round of questioning, and then happy to open it up to anyone who has a question. So over the next few minutes, think about if there's a question you have, and I'll just call out. If there are no questions, which I doubt will happen, but if there are no questions, I've got a whole notebook under my chair of questions that I can ask in rapid fire form. So, Professor Griffin, last month, a little over a month ago, White House counsel Pat Cipollone issued a letter to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi stating that your highly partisan and unconstitutional effort threatens grave and lasting damage to our democratic institutions, to our system of free elections, and to the American people. And you responded to that in an LA Times article, saying that you called the letter a political stunt that misinterprets the Constitution, ignores relevant precedents, and defies common sense. Professor Griffin says what she thinks. It's very...
Generally, yes.
So if you went on to state that the White House letter set the stage for a constitutional crisis, which really struck me. And I wanted to ask you this question. So on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is the dissolution of our union.
Civil War, yeah.
Yeah. What would a 7 or 8 be on your constitutional crisis scale?
The president defying an order from the Supreme Court. So I don't think that we are there yet. It is one thing for the executive branch to say we are not going to engage with Congress, which is, we should acknowledge, shocking. And that was the tone and tenor of the letter that the White House issued. They have told people not to cooperate, and they have failed for a variety of reasons, including the nature of the people involved, as you've described. But their position is the president cannot be indicted, only impeached. But the president cannot be impeached unless he gets effectively a criminal trial at the beginning of the impeachment process. And the president will not allow anyone to testify or turn over any documents or respond to any congressional subpoenas in said impeachment process. So it's a loop out of which you could never exit, which is what I meant by it defying common sense. The demands for criminal trial level protections at the early stages of an investigation intended only to level charges and not to try the facts of it. That's the Senate's job. And the Constitution could not be more, it's not clear about a lot of things. One thing that it is very clear about, the House has the sole power of impeachment, and that is all it says. There are no prescribed procedures. There are no specific rules about it. It is the House's job to level charges. And the Senate shall have the sole power to try that case. And also no prescribed procedures. So we don't know. The Senate has to, at the beginning of that process, make some rules. How many days of testimony? Is it videotaped depositions or live witnesses? How much time do the president's lawyers get? How much time do the House managers get? They're going to have to define all of that because the Constitution doesn't have any rules. But it is clear that this is, in fact, not some extra constitutional coup, but one of the most obvious statements of what the House's power is in the Constitution. It's right there in Article 1. So the letter is nonsense and has actually, it rarely gets mentioned anymore. It made a big splash the first couple of days after it was issued. And it's so profoundly nonsensical that that anyone on that side is embarrassed to even talk about it at this point. And because I teach law, I'm a little embarrassed that a lawyer wrote it. And that's something that both, but that's something that, conservatives, and I mean, everybody on the entire political spectrum who has legal training thought that the letter was a disgrace, because it suggests that there is no process of any kind through which there can be any accountability for the executive branch. And that clearly can't be true. At the same time, we're not unfamiliar with skirmishes between Congress and the White House. This is not the only administration in which such skirmishes have occurred. Ordinarily, there would be some good faith negotiation about what documents Congress actually can have, what needs to be redacted, what's privileged, which witnesses are too important to come testify in front of Congress, or what have you. There hasn't been any negotiation or accommodation. There's just been sort of obstruction and slow walking from this administration. I wouldn't call that alone a constitutional crisis, although I do think that that letter was the first affirmative, sweeping statement of comprehensive noncompliance with any demands that Congress might have with respect to exercising oversight of any kind. We will, though, get to a crisis if it turns out that the Supreme Court is called upon to decide whether a particular witness needs to testify, or whether a subpoena is valid, or whether the president has to turn over his tax returns, or some aspect of this congressional investigation. In the Nixon impeachment, the Supreme Court decided that they had to turn over the tapes from the Oval Office, and that's what led to Nixon's resignation, ultimately, because it was unthinkable that he wouldn't turn over the tapes once the Supreme Court said that he would have to. We get to the 7 or 8 if the Supreme Court says you have to show us something in that server full of calls with foreign leaders that have been deep-sixed, or you have to turn over some records or produce some witness, and the White House says no. The Supreme Court doesn't have a police force. The marshals aren't going to walk over to the White House and extract those documents. So that's the constitutional crisis that is short of a civil war, but incredibly grave. And we could get there.
Thanks, I guess. Thanks. I tried to find very positive questions, by the way, with this. To what extent do you think this whole impeachment process puts the U.S. in a positive light, that it shows that there are, no one's above the law, and that investigations will happen however unwieldy? Or to what extent does it more show us to be increasingly dysfunctional?
Nah. It's nothing positive about it. I mean, the argument was made, look, we bend but didn't break. We're not like France that went through 5 republics. 2 points. One is, one of the other things I found really chilling was when the White House Chief of Staff, trying to kind of cover himself, said, "Get over it." I found that incredibly chilling. This notion that, we're doing things the way we want to do and get over it. I mean, this, in terms of all the guardrails and norms and institutions we have in the system, and reflecting of an attitude, that one, there's a lot of stuff out there, that one really stopped me in my tracks. But the other point I'll say, that this part of that, BJ, is, and this actually came out of a conversation with an international colleague who's friendly to the United States, but he said, look, some of you are coming over here saying, don't worry, we'll get back to normal, we'll re-equilibrate, whatever, we'll win the next election, or there'll be impeachment. Let me tell you how we see the last 20, 25 years of American politics. They say, so in 1998, you tried to impeach a president on some deeply offensive personal behavior, unquestionably, but it was turned into an impeachment, right, for only the second time in your history. In 2000, you have an election that has to go to your Supreme Court to be decided. In 2003, you go to war on a war that many of us in the international community did not want, after we, by the way, had rallied around you after 9/11. In 2007 and 8, you elect, an extraordinary African American for the first time in your history, which we may have liked, but talk about swinging the pendulum. And then 2016, you swing way to the other side and elect Donald Trump. Tell me again why I can expect that you're going to find some equilibrium point and some steady course forward. That's a really important analysis that helps us understand that as bad as things are with this president, in some respects he is an effect, not just a cause. And there are issues that would have been there if the election outcome was different in 2016, and there'll be issues that will be there of an even greater magnitude now because the ways he is a cause. But we have to understand, not just in foreign policy, but in many ways that, that there's a lot of problems there. And so I don't take any satisfaction or comfort in the notion that we still have processes at work in this country that we're not breaking. We may not get to civil war, although I actually do worry a lot about violence if this happens, a lot, enabled. But I think that's an important perspective. Otherwise, it's all about Donald Trump, and if it wasn't Donald Trump, everything would be great. Well, there are deeper issues.
So let's build on that. Professor Hildebrand, my last question for this round, and then we'll open it up. By my count, I was just sitting here thinking about it, so I may be off by one, but of the last 8 presidents who've been elected, 3 have gone through an impeachment process. Nixon resigned before it became full-fledged, but 3 out of 8 is a 38%. It's a pretty high number. And to Professor Jentleson's point, if someone else, if Hillary Clinton had been elected, who knows if a Republican House would have found a way to initiate impeachment probe of her. And so my question is, I guess, to what extent is this becoming the norm? And maybe, is there a way out of this?
I appreciate that optimistic final note, although I'm afraid I'll disappoint gravely on that. No. Of course, we're at a public policy school, so my answer is that 3 data points does not constitute a trend. But it is hard to escape the conclusion that the impeachment process, which was designed as intended as this constitutional safety valve, is increasingly becoming potentially another front in this era of partisan warfare. And it's certainly plausible to imagine hypothetically in a future Republican Congress with a future Democratic president, perhaps the other way around, impeachment being pursued on grounds lesser than we have today or even lesser than those for President Clinton. But I do think the comparison with Clinton is instructive in that, not to dwell too much on public opinion again, but public support currently for impeachment is higher than it was than it was at any point during the Clinton proceedings. And that to me signifies that the American public, or at least some portion of the electorate, is still capable of evaluating the case and making judgments about whether the process is being used appropriately or not. And that while that may be a somewhat weak safeguard, that will continue to offer some safeguard against the abuse of power or the abuse of the process in the future. Now, I think that also alludes to the concluding point that Professor Jentleson made about so much of this, what's happening today, is not going to go away whenever and however the current president goes away. And there's going to be a lot of reckoning about how much of this we can sort of put back in the box versus not. I'm personally hopeful that impeachment continues to be seen by most of the public and hopefully by their leaders as a last resort. But that's a statement I make with some degree of faith, more so than recent evidence, I guess.
Thank you. So with that, open it up if there are any questions, and if not, I'll jump in with another. We have about 15 minutes left. Yes, Matt.
This is for Professor Griffin. So, Ambassador Sondland just changed his testimony today. And so my question is, when does it become a situation of obstruction of justice that were perjury, and then when, I'm assuming that there are these other people who refuse to comply with subpoenas and things like that. When can we start seeing that they would be charged with some crime, or is there a mechanism for that? And then when is the time limit out that, oh yeah, I meant to change my estimate?
Yeah, I think Ambassador Sondland has realized he was in a little bit over his head. And yeah, he didn't donate $1 million to become an ambassador so he could spend the rest of his life in prison. And he has a good lawyer. I mean, that was the right thing to do. Why should he be under bust in all of this? I mean, he went and corrected his testimony, and we'll see. So there are two answers to your question that I think they're two different questions. So one is, what does all the obstruction portend? And the other is, what are the repercussions for the witnesses who, today nobody showed up who was supposed to testify. I think that's probably, I don't think that Ambassador Bolton is going to show. I mean, I think at this point, I think you can subpoena anybody you want. They're not coming. And we'll have to see, later on down the road, depending on what emerges. We don't know. It's an extremely fast-moving situation. Are there going to be people who want immunity? Are there going to be people who want to get out in front of the historical legacy? Does Bolton think that a great last chapter for his book is, that he strides up to Capitol Hill and is the last honest man in Washington? I don't know. So who's going to but the answer to your question is, the enforcement of congressional subpoenas is very tricky, because the ways that you can do it are, one, hold people in contempt of Congress, which they've done a few times in recent months with related investigations. But the Justice Department has to enforce, that's criminal contempt. And that only works if the Justice Department then brings criminal charges against the people who are defying Congress, which, needless to say, the Justice Department has not done with respect to any of the witnesses in any of the, they've asked, Jared Kushner to come talk, they've asked people to come talk about security clearances, they wanted to talk about the census controversy, they've sent out subpoenas and letters and requests, and all kinds of people have told them to take a hike. And they refer those things, but the Justice Department is not going to bring those criminal cases. They could sue, and they have done so, and there's some ongoing cases. They could just have their lawyers go to court and enforce Congress's prerogatives and bring a civil suit. And the problem there is that litigation takes time. So that means delay, and that actually works in favor of the people who are trying to prevent the testimony and documents from being revealed. One of the smart things, I think, that Adam Schiff and the lawyers he's working with, some very, very good lawyers, decided early on is, we're not going to be tripped up by obstruction. We're just going to add it to the articles of impeachment. And that was one of the articles of impeachment for Nixon, and it was one of the articles of impeachment for Clinton. So there is good precedent for doing that. And instead of going and litigating every little bit of evidence that's being withheld from them, they're letting it kind of run on some parallel track where ideally they'd get it someday, but they realize they probably never will. Add it to the articles of impeachment, keep on moving, call your next witness. And that seems to be their strategy. I think that was a very smart decision.
Yes, over here.
English is not my first language. My first language is Ukrainian. So I've been following this from both sides. There was some news today, about Ms. Yovanovitch, Ambassador Yovanovitch's testimony, and there was somebody who apparently read it in Ukraine, and it made me think that there was a quid pro quo agreement with the previous president. But the question that I have is, what is this going to do for U.S. foreign policy? And especially in that part of the world, and especially with other issues like China and
Well, again, this whole question of allies can't trust America's word under this president. Again, it hasn't been perfect in the past, but it's particularly bad now. And the personalization of it, right? So you could say that if President Trump told Guatemala that they wouldn't get their foreign aid unless they work with him on his anti-immigrant policy, that's politicizing that, but for a particular policy that I might not agree with, but you could say is the national interest. This was all about personal politics, right? And you even read how the previous president, everybody's briefed how to basically stroke Trump's ego. So the irony, of course, is that, the manipulation, comes from the other side. You tell him nice things, you give him a photo op with the North Korean leader, and then that's all he cares about. The Israelis have done this. And then he even sort of turned on them when the election outcome was muddled, and he was asked, well, do you want Bibi Netanyahu to be the next prime minister? He said, our relations are with the state of Israel, which is like a message to somebody. So I think the question really is, American leadership and whoever comes into office to restore that. Now, again, the world was changing, okay? And the notion that somehow the United States was going to be, running the world like we did in the Cold War in the first decade after the end of the Cold War, that wasn't going to happen. And I can tell you, I was involved in the Hillary Clinton campaign, and we were beginning to have conversations about what would be different about a foreign policy than even the Obama foreign policy had done. So there was a state of flux there. But right now, everybody can take advantage of it. Putin knows he can do basically anything he wants to do. I don't have a new Cold War view of China, but they've got a lot of running room because we're distracted, right? So there's not a positive in this for American foreign policy. And I will say, the demoralization of the Foreign Service is just, it's going to last a long time. There are a lot of students in the room who may be thinking of international careers, and you might have been thinking maybe I'll go in the Foreign Service, or maybe I'll go in the NGO world, or go to the Peace Corps. And I know students I've talked to, the incentives for doing that, are much lower. What if this happens again? And you've seen some incredibly brave people taking on difficult assignments and being totally thrown under the bus, Ambassador Ivanovich and all these other people. And that's just for the human capital we need to run our foreign policy for the next generation. In some ways, that bothers me almost more than anything else.
Thank you. Yes, over here. Yes.
Continue a little bit of discussion you introduced. As it moves to the Senate, what can we expect in terms of how the rules, evidence, trial, enforcement, is that part of a partisan set of decisions, or to what extent does the presider, the Chief Justice, have a vote in that? What do we expect?
Do you want to be our Congress expert, or do you want me to take it?
Go, in terms of rules of procedure, I happily defer to you.
So it will look a lot more like a trial than the House proceedings do, because there will be witnesses and the president's lawyers will be able to ask questions. The House proceedings are, they haven't even had a special counsel on this, so they're really starting from scratch, and they're sort of ramping up. They'll probably, take some time now in the Intelligence Committee, and then it'll go over to the Judiciary Committee, look a little bit more familiar with more of a tussle between two sides. Eventually, articles of impeachment, which are an indictment, and then it'll go straight to the Senate, and there's no prescribed process. There's some precedent. So if memory serves, the Clinton proceeding they agreed that the House managers would have about 4 days to present their case, and then the president's lawyers had about 4 days to respond. They did videotaped depositions of a lot of the witnesses. So that's obviously not what a criminal trial looks like. But it'll mostly be up to the Senate. But it is a strange and unprecedented situation to have those who are going to be the fact finders, the jurors voting on it, also deciding who they want to hear from and for how long. But that is basically how it works. The Chief Justice role is ceremonial, and we would be in a really interesting position if there were actual disputes about what to do next. The one thing that does seem clear procedurally is that the vice president has no role. So, to the extent there's some thought that there will be a motion to dismiss, for example, from some group of senators, and that there might be a majority to proceed with a trial, because even if there isn't the 2/3 required to remove, there are at least 4 or 5 senators of good conscience or who have political reasons to want to appear to have good conscience, who will vote with the Democrats, and that if it's 50-50, the Chief Justice will have to decide on a motion to dismiss, perhaps, or something like that. Everything other than that is kind of a mystery. I mean, I imagine that there will be a few days for each side to make their case, and some method of gathering evidence short of having lengthy, drawn-out testimony and cross-examination of every single witness.
Terrific. Let's do up to 2 more questions, then I'll ask one last one. Yes, over here.
What role does election year has to play with these procedures? Do you think what happened a year ago, the same thing came out would be different?
I'm not sure it would be different if it were a year ago, other than perhaps Democratic leadership would have moved more quickly and sort of had a higher risk tolerance for taking it on if these revelations had come out then than they have. This isn't exactly what you're asked, but I'll just briefly address the 2020 election because I think that our thinking on this has changed somewhat too in the last couple of months, in that there had been a conventional wisdom that impeachment would be kind of a net positive for Republicans in 2020 or for President Trump and his reelection. And it's certainly the case that if you look around the country if you look at the country as a whole, there's support for impeachment. President Trump is deeply unpopular, but if you zoom in on the 6 or 7 battleground states that will determine the Electoral College, on average, the president's more popular, impeachment is less popular, and that's been kind of the continued source of Democratic anxiety about moving forward with the process. That being said, I do think the sort of conventional wisdom that this would be a net benefit for Trump has changed, or I don't fully buy it for 2 reasons. One is because public opinion, again, can change, has changed and can change, and additional leadership and sort of risk-taking on the part of how the House conducts the process can move people's opinion. But the other reason has something to do with, I guess, my theory of the election itself, which is that it's really an election that's going to be decided by whose base is more motivated, with some swing voters on top of that, and that impeachment may be a little more mixed for swing voters, but for the Democratic base, it's a highly motivating issue. And in a scenario where, where the House impeaches, the Senate fails to acquits, fails to remove, then it might be even more motivating for Democratic voters who feel like they have to take matters into their own hands. Now, it's also sure to be a motivating issue for Republican voters, so there's a little bit of evening out there. But if the outcome from all of this is that President Trump emerges from this process, let's say sometime next spring or summer, sort of damaged with independents and maybe a few Republicans, with a highly motivated Democratic base that feels that it has no recourse other than to take care of business at the polls, then that's probably a pretty good outcome for Democrats politically.
Let me just add 2 quick political points on that. One for both for Democrats. One is that, not just the base, but people that are kind of, let's call them independents, might look at Democrats and say, if you didn't move on this, something that supposedly you really believe in, then, what's your backbone going to be on general issues? And so there's a real, I think, sense of doing what you believe in without even, the micro calculations outplays politically. The other, I think, is a number of strategists are saying for some of those Republicans in the Senate who are in swing states, Tom Tillis in North Carolina, Cory Gardner in Colorado, Susan Collins in Maine, Arizona, to take a tough vote. If they vote against impeachment and the evidence has come out really strong, it increases your chances of winning the Senate in 2020. So the politics are cutting in a lot of different directions.
I'm going to add one thing, and then I'm just going to ask one final question. There are some really interesting numbers. You look at all the Democrats who won House seats against Republicans in 2018, and if you look at the available polling, in most of the cases, the Republican incumbent, or the incumbent party, Republican Party, if the Republican had retired and another Republican was running in their place, was leading in some poll in September or October, early October. And in all of those cases, it went Democrat. And if you look at Brett Kavanaugh being confirmed to the Supreme Court, it was a short-term victory for the Republicans, but there is some evidence, or at least correlation, with that and a drop in polling numbers of these hotly contested races for Republicans. And there's some question that I have over whether really 2020 will be decided on the inverse of whoever wins this impeachment battle. That essentially, does the fight go on and does that motivate, or we won the fight and it reduces motivation? And with that, I want to ask, I think Professor Hildebrand, but it's open to everyone, if President Trump wins re-election and he is not impeached, and then new evidence comes out that might be objectively or subjectively impeachable in 2022, I hate to end it on a sour note, but this is there any, basically, does a victory by Trump in 2020 inoculate him from anything else?
Well, I guess there's a legal answer to the question and a political answer to the question, and I'll defer to Professor Griffin on the legal answer, although I think the answer there is pretty much that there's no reason Democrats could not pursue another impeachment proceeding, especially based on new evidence of new crimes. But it's a scenario that very few Democrats want to even conceive of right now, because it feels like such just a blow to the gut to think about a scenario where Trump wins re-election and then they're having to go through this all over again. And so I would say you never say never. There could very well be back where we started, but it's awfully tough to contemplate having to gear up for this all over again.
Yeah, I would just say, B.J., polls are like weather reports. They tell us what the weather's going to be the next few days. They really don't tell you what it's going to be 2 or 3 weeks from now. And so all of these calculations that people are making, I think the best thing for Democrats is to do what you think is right. What your oath, this is an oath of office kind of issue. And if you can stand up and convince people that you really did it for the right reasons, not just because it's partisan, and you go out and you make the argument, that's what leadership is about, then you're going to be okay. There's not going to be, a conviction that doesn't have, there's plenty of evidence, I think, now already. I'm not a lawyer, but that's what I think. I don't think everybody's trying to calculate the polls, and like Asher said, Nixon was removing Nixon was at 19%, and then it changed based upon the evidence and the arguments presented. So I think Democrats have to, the biggest thing will be to make the case that this was right for the country. It wasn't just partisan squabbling, and there is a case there to be made.
Yeah, so you're absolutely, there's no double jeopardy for impeachment. There's also no appeal from impeachment. I mean, it doesn't have any of the assorted external trappings that we associate with trials. It's hard to say how a second term after both an impeachment and an electoral victory would play out. I don't know how that ends. I don't think it ends well. I guess, because as it is, there seems to be brazenness and a complete disregard for any level of accountability. It's really hard to imagine where we would get without even any electoral accountability at the back end, at which point I suppose we have to then set our sights on the criminal justice process and whatever leverage may come from knowing that eventually you're not president anymore, and what comes next. But that's not encouraging. One thing that might be encouraging is an answer to your question, actually. One of the questions that you asked is, what did my students conclude after so my colleague Sam Buell and I taught this class on the presidency and criminal investigations, and we taught it in what now seems like ancient history during the Mueller investigation. We asked all of our students at the end, after we looked at all kinds of things, all the various mechanisms that are designed to create a sort of mechanism for accountability, for oversight, to protect against criminality in the executive branch. And the students came to the conclusion that we hadn't been ready. We were ready for all kinds of things, but we don't have a system that was really well equipped to deal with actual bad faith. A lot of people who don't have any regard for the institutions that we all, hold in such high regard, the Supreme Court and the Justice Department or Congress or the Foreign Service, and that the whole entire system was ill-equipped to deal with a significant cohort not sharing, those allegiances to institutions and to democracy itself and the Constitution, because much of that was governed by norms and understandings and unwritten rules. We may have to write some of them down going forward. If there's a time when we're all sifting through the ashes of this and reconstructing things, that might be one place to start. But the other thing the students said is, we got to vote. That's what they said at the end of our class, that they had figured out that this is like the time for dealing with this is in the electoral process, and that the accountability has to come, from people hitting the streets and going to the polls and caring enough to get involved. And a lot of them had been, somewhat disaffected before taking the class, and they sort of came to the realization that no one else is looking out for you, that you got to vote. So one answer to, what comes next is people have to vote.
Well, given that this is Election Day, that's a perfect way to end it. Please join me in thanking Professor Lisa Griffin, Bruce Jentleson, Asher Hildebrand. And thank you all for coming out tonight. We appreciate it.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.